Good morning and welcome. Today we're talking about the four pillars of self-mastery. It's a continuation of what we talked about yesterday. I'll talk about it tomorrow and the next day, but going deeper or hitting it at different angles. This is part of a workshop that I'll be doing later in January on the 22nd, a full day workshop where we actually do exercises to make sure that those four pillars are experienced, and that's the first step towards getting them part of our normal everyday activities. It's There's nothing that's new here, not new to scientists and researchers. Everything I talk about is exists in research. Neuroscientists talk about it, but it's mostly in the lab, and there's a process that things go through in order to get these paradigm shifts, and that's what this is. And I would say I'm not a researcher, I'm an integrator, and I would say that I'm not debunking anything that's already out there. I'm an early adopter to an aggregated view of what already exists. And the point there is that there are silos, and a lot of the information lives in silos. And in silos, the people in the silos are incentivized to do research or to communicate inside of a frame. They're not incentivized to change the frame. And so what happens is they don't necessarily speak to each other, and they're focused on their own silo. And as a result, what we end up with is having to piece it together ourselves, or in many cases, it's just not talked about. It's just avoided because it creates too much confusion, and a confused mind doesn't act. And marketing people know that we've got to have some form of clarity to get to get our message across. All right, now the slide I had up earlier at the beginning is this slide, and it's because the platform or the organization or the work I should say is dynamic leadership, and dynamic leadership is aligned with emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence has four pillars: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. In January and February, I'm focused on self-awareness and self-management, and then we get into the leadership, using that to lead. And then later in March, end of February and March, we'll be into executive leadership, setting the climate, the organization. So all that's aligned with emotional intelligence. What's different is that emotional intelligence talks about the parts of the brain, like the amygdala, the hippocampus, et cetera, what's going on in the basal ganglia. And that's difficult for a person to access. How do you know what's going on in the amygdala and the hippocampus, let alone move it from one area to another? That's not something that happens. The good news is that the brain is made up of neurons, and neurons all, for this level of conversation, work the same way. And so once you understand how to govern and manage neurons and condition them, you understand how to take charge of the entire thing. Now, this is not mental health. I don't get into mental health. This is about business and enabling leaders to have high performance organizations with repeatability and predictability. We don't want to have hit or miss. We don't want to have solutions that only work on a good day of a good week. We need solutions that work on a bad day of a bad week. And that's why I talk about this. Now, I'm going to jump in here and start with the presentation. I have a table there. Now, a lot of times we talk about things in threes, but when I think about a structure, I want four legs on there. I want something that's stable. Anyone who's ridden a tricycle or a three wheeler knows that there's this weakness that's in between the wheels from side to side that it's very easy for it to topple over. And that's why I go with the four legs. And again, what I talk about today, it exists in other places, but hopefully this will resonate. And then in the workshop, what I do is I dissect each pillar, and we do exercises so that you can experience that pillar and then use it in real time in life. And we get through all of that in the workshop. We start small and keep it small in the workshop to introduce the skill, and then you're able to use that skill for more complex activities. Now, here's the example of you can have a one-legged table and stack things on it. And so I'm thinking here, your life design, your goals, your purpose, relationships, you can stack things on that one-legged table, but there's some risk there. Even though it may be stable, as long as everything is balanced, you get it out of balance and it can tip over. You can see that. Even with the two-legged table, and you see these legs are very broad, so it's going to be stable, more stable this way than it is this way. So two legs have a weakness as well, and this is why we have to have why I want to focus on the four pillars, and then we have the three, and that's what I was talking about. You push down on one of these corners, and it's more easily tipped over than with four legs. Now, here's the four pillars. One is knowledge. Knowledge, and I say to know and not do is like not knowing. To know and not do is like not knowing. So we have to make sure that we're taking action. But knowledge can accelerate the assimilation. It can accelerate being able to act because you're not confused. A confused mind doesn't act. So sometimes there's knowledge that's necessary to keep the mind from being confused. Then we have habit mastery. And the reason I put habit mastery second is because in order to feel like you can do the next two, three, and four, you have to understand how habits, or I should say, it's helpful to understand how habits are actually constructed and what you can do to change a habit. I don't really say change habits, I say add a new one. And by adding a new habit, it replaces the old one. That's just the way the structure is set up. And then we have state mastery. So now, once you have the habit figured out, you'll recognize that, okay, on a good day of a good week, I can do it. On a bad day of a bad week, not a chance. And we have to get it to the point where we can manage our state. So this becomes prevention and activation. It's both a resistance factor and an empowerment catalyst. A resistance factor, if you allow it to dominate you, it's an empowerment catalyst if you leverage it. So we have to have state mastery is the next one. That's number three. And then I put four in there for forgiveness because there are very, very capable people who are able to teach all of this content, but then they struggle with certain relationships. And if you look closely, it's not the relationship as it is today, it's bringing hurt from the past into the present. Again, I'm not talking about mental health, but if a person has an open wound, I'll call it, from the past, and it could be from childhood, and it's unresolved. But it's like having a open, like I said, an open wound, and because associations work the way they are, neurons that fire together wire together, and also the ones that are wired together they fire together. And if someone says something, or there's a song that's played, or a picture, or a thought that comes in, and it reminds them of that thing that happened years ago, you can see how it's easily possible for it to bring back the feelings. And now those feelings are brought into today's situation. And even though the person you're interacting with has nothing to do with what happened 10 or 20 years ago, that you lose some of your agency. And when you lose your agency, it's possible that you'll say things that you don't mean to say, do things that you don't mean to do. I like to say trust is built on the escalator going up, but you can lose it like falling out the window. Okay. All right. Excuse me. So the first one is knowledge, as I said, and if you can screenshot that slide if you want, but here it says sense making and orientation to reality. What's true? What matters? And what actually causes results? So there's this. I like to say, if you follow principles and you build your plans on principles, it's as though the world conforms around you because principles are principles. But too often, when we have communication and there's cognitive biases and there's fandom and there's preferences and even alternative facts, we've heard that term, it's easy for people to get off center. So I'm talking, what we're talking about here is, I like to use the term MISI. It's mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive, making sure that what we're talking about is actually true. So I base things on principles, and when I look at knowledge, I don't just look at it as a photograph. I look at it a video that's going forward and a video that's going backwards. In fact, it's a multi-dimension video because I want to know where this came from. So it's like if you ask a person, well, how are you feeling? And they give you some answer, it might help to know where they came from. They might say, hey, I'm not doing so good. But then if you ask them, well, what's going on? And they tell you, yeah, well, 4 weeks ago, I got hit by a car and all this stuff happened and I'm about 60%, 70% healed, but still working through some things. That's a different conversation than if they told you that it's something more serious and they're still climbing up the hill. They're still going into more and more serious. It's just an example of you've got to look at more than just the photograph that is right now in front of you. Then we have, and what I use is the 7 performance series. The 7 performance series that's my model. So I looked at 12 areas, I looked at 6 areas, I looked at all these different examples, and I literally spent 2 years just juggling these, moving them around, and asking the question: what happens if I put this first? What happens if I put that one? What is it like if I put this one in front of the other one? And then doing the research and checking some of these other ones out. And there are some good ones out there, but I came up with this model because it supports the be, do, have. It supports agency, and it supports a view that I have that speaks to let's focus on what we can control before trying to control other people. And there's other references to that: circle of influence versus circle of concern, and there's more. So the first thing is knowledge. We have to have the knowledge. And in this mental era, if I'm talking about knowledge, I'm making a distinction between the network of neurons and the conscious mind. Well, I may use the word subconscious because it maps to what people know and think about. I don't use subconscious mind. I don't put it with the mind because the subconscious is not a mind. It's a network of neurons. It's energy going through neural pathways. It's not the mind. The mind can relate the unrelated. The mind can design into the field of infinite possibilities. And so one of the things there's a lot, like every one of these has multiple levers. The mental area has multiple levers. The physical area has multiple levers. We get it, and probably more than any, because physiology is such a powerful thing. Last week I did a talk on physiology, but there's so many aspects of it with the health, and then uh, the age decline line, and vitality, and so much of that goes into the physical. So we have levers, and that's one of the things we'll get into when we do the workshop on these pillars. Is what are the levers that you can pull to make a difference? Because it's not just enough to have knowledge; you have to be able to do something about it. And then there's spiritual. So the spiritual one is not the outside spiritual realm. It's what's within us. It's our higher self. It's what, if you want to say it this way, how we interact with the spiritual realm. But I don't want to confuse that. This is still in our control. We decide if we want to have faith or not. What you describe faith as, that's up to you. But you describe if you want to live by faith or you want to live by fate or by something else. Spiritual is important. You can think of spiritual as awareness of awareness. So when we talk about the present moment, that present moment is part thought, part consciousness, and part mind. And all of those, you want purity so that you can be clear thinking. And I talk about that present moment when we get into the 7 steps. So spiritual is a part of it. And then there's emotional. Now, emotional is like the gateway to the next 3, because you can get emotionally hijacked. You can have 100% agency in all of these until you're hit with some surprise, until that bad day of a bad week shows up, and emotionally you get hijacked. If you get hijacked emotionally, it makes relationships a little bit more difficult. So these 4 are in our control. Relationships, I say, are not totally in our control because they involve other people, as does professional. So if you think of relationships as part of professional, because if you have a business, if any kind of commerce, anything that's going on, every buyer needs a seller. And you could argue that, but at the end of the day, even financial traders are interacting with other people, whether they see them or not. There's other people on the other side of the trade. So the relationships and professional, and this is why I have the 4 pillars, because again, on a good day of a good week, you can do all the right things in relationships, you can do all the right things in professional, but something comes out of left field and triggers you into a negative state that you had when you were a young child, and next thing you know, your outcome becomes at risk. So the seven performance areas use the term financial because the point is be, do, have, creating the identity that's aligned with your quest. We don't want to start with financial because that takes us down a path that may not end well. But I also don't want to leave it at financial because financial is not the end in and of itself. It's a vehicle to get the outcomes that you want. And Tim Ferriss does a great job in his book showing how it's not the finances that enabled him to do what he did as he traveled the world. It was the design and the approach that he took. So he was living the life of a multimillionaire without being a multimillionaire in the beginning times. So that outcome becomes at risk if you lose the emotional part of it. And the other thing I'll point out about the spiritual is that I get real concerned when people talk about it's the universe because the universe is putting the responsibility out there. And also the universe opens you up to bad actors. So if you're looking for the universe to do something and they happen to know what you're looking for and that person gives you or offers you this thing, it could be a bad actor. That's how con men work, right? Con men know that you want X and then they show you how to get X without the effort. And next thing you know, you're following them and it's a nefarious act. That's the seven performance areas. I do laps around these. So these continue on. We talk about them in the beginning to get a common language. We don't spend a lot of time on the seven performance areas as they are. But as a coach, I can instantly tell where we're breaking down. And this is, again, why I have the four pillars, because even after you get all of this, there's still breakdown area. We'll get to that in the last pillar. So the next pillar is habit mastery. Now, you got to have habit control of your habits. And Joan Rosenberg, in her book 90 Seconds to a Life You Love, she talks about the emotional reset. She does a nice job of laying out how just the fear of going into an anxiety spiral can keep people from actually doing the things that they should be doing because they're worried about this uncontrollable anxiety spiral. I was talking to someone yesterday and they were talking about how it feels like there's somebody who's taking over the wheel of the car to drive. And even though you don't want them to, you're powerless to stop them. And then they're driving and you're just along for the ride. And next thing you know, there's a whole big mess to clean up. And it's this lack of understanding of how habits work that enables a person to believe that they're not in control. It's a process. And like most processes, they work better when you're following an effective strategy. So in that example I was using with the person taking over the wheel, by the time that feeling has happened, it's way too late. You're so deep into the habit process that it's not reversible with your level of action. You have to come out of that, and that's where I'll talk about taking a deep breath and anchoring to some other state. And it can be done in seconds once you have practice. In the beginning, it may take minutes, but think about this. If you allow that to happen and you allow that quote unquote invisible drive to take over the wheel and it lasts for more than a couple of minutes, that now becomes a feeling, a neurochemical event, which is now lodged in your neurons and accessible for future associations to tap into that. So you're just stacking on these problems. So you want to stop it. Even if it takes you 2 minutes to stop it, I would say, if you have to go look out the window for 2 minutes and say, excuse me a second, I need to make a call, or excuse me a second, let me just think about that and come back to it. Whatever you need to do to get away from that. Suppressing it doesn't work because the more you suppress it, remember the reason the driver in this imaginary example, the reason that imaginary driver has taken over the wheel is because they believe you're going to die. It's life or death. And they feel more equipped to handle things than you. And that's because you've been turning over the wheel to them so many times. You may not feel like you're turning it over to them. You may feel like they're grabbing it, but I'll show you that you are actually making that choice. And because it's life and death, if you try to suppress them, imagine trying to grab the wheel back from this imaginary person. They're just going to add more strength. They're going to use more strength. And if they're stronger than you in your mind, no matter what you do is going to help. And you can try and try and try and try. And all you do is escalate, escalate, escalate. And you're adding more emotional energy into it. And that energy is not positive. So that's just an example of why we want to focus on conditioning and automaticity. What runs by default under pressure? We want to understand that so you can actually govern it, and we'll get into that for sure. So here's a model I've used before, and on the bottom, if you look here in the bottom, it says associations in neural signal. That's on the neuron side. So I talked about the network of neurons. That's happening on the neuron side. This is automaticity. This is the stimulus response cycle before the conscious mind, or I should say stimulus reaction cycle before the conscious mind. Once the conscious mind comes in with conscious thought, as you can see on the bottom right, it's more of a conscious mind response. But too often people allow the response to equal the reaction. And that's what happens in that example where a person is triggered, or where this imaginary person takes over the wheel and is driving the car. That's a triggered response, and triggering begets more triggering, begets more triggering. I'm going to go into more detail in this, but there's something here. So this is step 2, which we'll get to that later. You'll see step 3 is the conditioned reaction. This is the 1 second that can change your life. It's 1 second that happens 33,000 times a day. It's every other second, right? If you're awake 65,000 seconds, we're going through this every other second. If you want to change your life, you have to understand this. And then there's step 4, and this is where the conscious mind is responding, not reacting. So what's left here is a recommendation for reaction. And what you do in step 4 is either execute on that reaction as is, or you pause for a half a second and turn it into a response. And a half a second is nothing in a conversation. It's absolutely nothing. So this is the example of agency. When you have agency, and we'll get into the steps, but steps 1 and 2, this has to do with your self-development and your current state of mind. Then you have the step 3, the conditioned reaction. This is that 1 second that happens 30,000 times a day. And then you have your conscious mind response, followed by emotional modulation if needed, and action and mindfulness, so that you're ready for the next one. So this is a more stable view. If you look at a triggered view, it's like this: steps 1 and 2 and 4 to 7 are gone, and you're just conditioned reaction, conditioned reaction, conditioned reaction, conditioned reaction. This is a triggered person. If you ever seen a video of somebody's triggered, or you've been interacting with somebody, maybe somebody has a phobia, you can just see it's boom, 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 and there's nothing you can do. Talking about the more you try to use some rational conversation, the more you become the enemy. They're attacking you because they see you as trying to cause them to die, because remember, the reason they're having this reaction is life and death. They're perceiving that threat as a tiger on the Serengeti, even though it's just an email, but it doesn't matter to them because they perceived it that way, and they're off and running, and the neurons are firing, and and then those neurons are bringing others in, because the ones that fire together wire together, and it just scales up, and eventually it subsides. Either the threat moment goes away or whatever happens, and then they're exhausted, and their body is filled with cortisol and possibly adrenaline, and they're stressed for hours. If you've ever been in this situation, you know what I'm talking about. You have this chemical event that happened, and we don't want that chemical event to happen. And the way you do that is by understanding the way that habits work. And so that goes back to here. So the first part of this, the pre-listening, is you're not even aware of that. This is happening all the time. The brain is always looking at the environment. If you go through a doorway, they say that's one of the best ways to change your state. You go through a doorway because the subconscious, the network of neurons, is automatically looking around to check the environment. It's like a hunter gatherer. They walk into a clearing. It's like, okay, this is potential danger. What's going on? And then you have the reaction time of the subconscious, which is a quarter of a second. It's not just twiddling its thumbs. It's looking, it's applying heuristics, it's the cognitive biases, it's initial detection, it's doing all those things that are preparing it for the reaction assembly, which is happening here. And then after the reaction assembly, the signal advances to the conscious mind. So there's a line that's crossed here. This is neurons, neuron signals, and over here you have conscious mind thought. The conscious mind is not going to interpret signals. So remember, this side is processing 11 million bits per second. This side processes at 50 bits per second. Part of this reaction assembly that's going on over here and advancing it to the conscious mind, it's a transition. It's taking the 11 million bits per second of information, imagine what it has, and is condensing it into a construct that can be perceived by the conscious mind. And this is where we get into trouble, because people are trying to fix it at the conscious mind level when it's millions and millions of pieces of information that have to be figured out. So by understanding this on the front end, what you realize is, okay, we need to be very careful about letting this line get crossed. This is not something to be taken lightly. When it crosses from the subconscious into the conscious, that's where we want to pause. Now, this wasn't always the case of it being so significant, right? In a hunter gatherer time, things go slow. You don't have the technology, you don't have the 5,000 to 10,000 ad stimuli hitting you per day. So you don't have as much to be reacting to. And tigers are tigers, and, you know, rabbits are rabbits, and so the threat is much more contained. But what the subconscious has done, because it's overwhelmed, it has overwhelmed the conscious mind. It's almost like any threat is at the tiger level. So we do an exercise to stop the subconscious from having a bias towards threat, and that's a big part of this, because we slow it down. Once you slow it down, you're no longer falling into this mode. But just by slowing it down, you're making this less likely. I like to say that with the positivity exercise, what happens is you go from something like 80% of the stimuli being a threat to something like 20%. You go to something like 20% being perceived as a threat. And that alone is going to slow this down. Plus, it's going to give you more agency. All right, now I just showed you a picture of I just showed you a picture of how the we go from the network of neurons over to the conscious mind. I'm depicting that here. So on this side of the line, we have the mind and constructs. And on this side, we have neurons and elements. So if I was talking to you about physical stuff, right, muscle memory, you know that athletics or movement is a compilation of other elements. Running is a compilation of other elements. There's no surprise there. And if I tell you that muscle memory is actually made up of several things, like there's acetylcholine, there's glutamate, those are neurotransmitters, there's dopamine that's involved, and then the way to train that muscle memory is with repetition, maybe intensity, maybe duration, maybe precision. You probably wouldn't doubt that. You would say, yeah, maybe I wouldn't have articulated it that way, but yeah, that makes sense. You get it at the physical skill level. Very few people would see it at the identity level. If I told you that, yes, identity is a construct too. Identity is a construct just like muscle memory. And there are elements that make up identity. And you're not going to change identity from the identity side, just like you're not going to change muscle memory from the will. So you're not going to will your muscle memory to be something, right? So you're not going to will your identity to be something different. You have to change it at the element side. But fewer people would agree with that. That's what I'm depicting with this graph. So let's look at this a different way. If I took a line and I said on one side of this line, we have neurons, and on the other side of this line, we have mind. And I'm talking about what people refer to as the subconscious, so the network of neurons. And if I said that XYZ is happening in the network of neurons, but you think it's happening in the mind, we have to decide which one is the right view. And this is why I said that I'm not responsible for this research. I'm just an early adopter. I've spoken to neuroscientists, and 100% I will tell you that what you think of as what the subconscious mind does is what's going on in the network of neurons. There are not two systems over here. There's not a subconscious and a network of neurons. There's a network of neurons over here, and that has been what the philosophers have told us is the subconscious mind, but they didn't have the brain scanning tools available to them that we do today to see the parts of the brain lighting up, etc. So that's important. And this is what I was saying, is that over here, you might think of it as identity, but over here, there are many, many elements, and some of those elements are even constructs. So, for example, I would say confidence is a construct. I would say uh, risk tolerance is a construct, but the elements that make that up are not as easily understood as it is when we're talking about the physical part of it. Now, also, if I put on this side of the line, I have elements, and on this side, I have constructs. So, for example, vitality would be a construct. So is personality. I said confidence already. What are the elements that make up vitality? You're going to have hydration, nutrients. I mean, you could go on and on, right? If you made a list, you could come up with a list, and it's a good, great starting point. Researchers would have more things over here. So this is actually, when you look at it as neurons in mind, these are all the associations. The elements are the associations. And if we want to change our identity, we have to change our associations. And what are the associations? The associations are neural pathways that connect together. How do you change neural pathways? Myelin. With you do that with deep practice. Synaptogenesis. But just like talking about parts of the brain, the amygdala and the hippocampus, when the brain is processing 11 million bits per second, you can't get your hands are wrapped around that. But what we can do is focus on associations and neural pathways. And then by understanding how we change neural pathways, that's where you start to make progress. So this is the view of habit mastery, understanding habits. We first have to understand habits before we're going to be able to make the changes necessary. But hopefully, by laying it out this way, that there's mind and constructs, and you don't change things at the construct level, you change them at the elements level. And to understand how you govern, you have to make the distinction between the mind and the neurons. So this is just an illustrative acceptance view. I don't have any research to back up exactly how these work. I'm just showing you how there's a continuum from identity, which is less understood as a construct versus element, to something like physical skills, which is more understood like a construct versus elements. And if I said skipping, skipping would be a construct, but nobody would doubt me if I said, yes, skipping involves balance and you have to have your hands moving in a certain way, and there's this bounce that has to happen. You can pull apart what skipping looks like. So I'll leave it there. And then the next pillar is state mastery. Because once you have the habits figured out, and you could do it on a good day of a good week, this is like being able to swim in a swimming pool, and then somebody takes you and throws you into an ocean that's crazy. You may not be able to handle it. You may be just fine in the swimming pool, but in the ocean it doesn't work. The same thing, this is like under pressure, right? Person can make free throws all day long, but then when it's the game winning free throw, it's more pressure than they can handle. So we have to have state mastery so that on a bad day of a bad week, we're still able to function. Real time agency, maintaining access to choice in the present moment. And what I talk about here in this pillar is not just having a growth mindset, but being able to get to a growth mindset very quickly, no matter how much chaos is going on. So we have to be able to manage that present moment. So we're always in charge. And what it takes is slowing things down. So again, when a person is in a triggered state, things are happening in milliseconds, you know, quarter of a second, half a second, and to pause for a second or two to take a long, deep breath, get back into present moment. You're not fighting against the tiger where the risk is life and death is measured in milliseconds. You're dealing with something that's much slower than that. So taking 2 or 3 seconds to get back to calm, and that's how you get that imaginary driver away from the wheel and back in the back seat, right? Because the subconscious sub is below. So we don't want the subconscious taking over, right? We need to stay in that higher self position. So that's the state management, and this is another view of that. So here's your conditioned reaction over and over and over. Whereas when you have agency, there's a pre-stimulus phase. This would be steps 1 and 2, and then there's a response side, which would be steps 4 through 7. You come back to a present moment kind of mindfulness state, and that positions you for the next conditioned reaction. So step 1 is how we develop. Step 2 is how we access the development real time. And this is where we get to the not know to know and not do is like not knowing, because if you don't, you may know the information, but if you can't access it, you may know the difference between a growth and fixed mindset, but if you can't access it in the moment when when the stakes are high, then you're going to be limited in terms of just how much risk you can handle and how much accomplishment you can come up with in a given setting. And here's your steps. I've been promising that I would get to this. So there's your steps 1, 2, 3, and you can take a screenshot of that. I'll take my picture off. So those are the steps in the 7-step reset. And we'll go through those. I talk about this in both the habit side and the state side, because this is the state, this is the stimulus reaction, and this is returning to the state. So it lives in both. And again, agency view versus the uh, triggered view. So this is the agency view. You have the pre-stimulus condition reaction response. So this is a good repeat. But again, 33,000 times a day. And where this comes from, if you look up how many decisions does a human make in a day, you'll see 33,000 times. Well, we also know that 95% of all our habits are, 95% of our actions are habitual. So that suggests we're probably looking at 30 to 31,000 decisions a day, because they're really stimulus response cycles. And of course, 33,000 is an average. So some people are going to be much lower and some people are going to be higher. You can imagine a person being triggered when you can see boom, 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 boom happening all in 1 second, right? These are quarter-second uh, intervals there. You can see where a person's going to have many, many more times than that. And the more of these you're going through, the higher beta brainwave you'll be in, the less you'll be in this power of now kind of thing, this flow state. So it makes sense. I would think that I'm well below that because I ignore most of them. I've set myself up so that I just ignore them, and the ones that do get through, they don't get the time of day. And that's not anything magical. That comes down to the positivity. So just by taking that positivity exercise I talked about earlier, and reducing the perceived threat from 80% of stimuli being perceived threat to 20% of them being perceived threat, that's a big part of it. And then the second big part is emotional modulation. So emotion is energy. Emotion, it passes through in 90 seconds. We want to get that back under back to homeostasis, if you will. And most people, what they try to do is suppress the emotion. You have 90 seconds about for it to pass through. If you keep it there, harbor it for 20 seconds, for more than 90 seconds, dwelling on it, etc., then it becomes a neurobiological event. It becomes an association in your neural pathways. And now you have this feeling that can be accessed and escalated and brought up again. So between the positivity exercise and the emotional modulation, what we're doing is reducing the amount of stimulus response that actions that we have or cycles that we have every day. And by doing that, you're going to have more agency, more calm, more time to follow your purpose and work on your life design. So this is a summary again, step 3. So there's your 7 steps. This is the step 3 I'm focusing on: conditioned reaction and the handoff to the conscious mind. So this gets back to that the drawing that I made, right? We have the conditioned reaction and we have the handoff. And there's a line. This line is very small, it's a very narrow line, but it takes a lot to cross it, because as you talk to people, and like I said, there's domains. So a person may agree with this if I'm talking about muscle memory. Yeah, that makes sense that the neural pathways they wrap with myelin, and then that helps the uh, that muscle movement becomes the path of least resistance. So you're more likely to get that muscle movement rather than another one. People get that. But then when you start talking about it in terms of personality, it doesn't make sense. So people try to change their personality or their identity at the construct level. You have to go in and do it at the element level, which is the point about the habits. Now, this is again another view. So I took that other diagram and I wanted to expand it because I say there's 7 phases. So you have pre-listening, initial detection. Pre-listening is T minus 100. So if this is the stimulus, this green mark is the stimulus. Then you have initial detection. So that's that first 100 milliseconds. And then the next 150 milliseconds is rapid appraisal. So these are actually two steps, this initial detection and rapid appraisal. You're not going to be able to feel this. You're not going to understand it. But knowing that it's there gives you a chance to understand the power of just slowing down and taking a breath. Just by slowing this down, you're going to change what that appraisal is. Give yourself more time. It's not a tiger, right? That's really what you need to know. Is it a tiger? No. Okay, let me take my time. And that becomes a habit. So that's sort of what the positivity exercise does, but it's more complex and far-reaching than that. Then we have reaction formation. So we're still under 500 milliseconds because the conscious mind comes online at a half a second about. And this changes. I'll show you on the next slide. So this reaction formation, this is why I say stimulus reaction, and then we have the response over here. So after the reaction and the handoff to the conscious mind. So this is the pre-conscious surfacing, right? This is the handoff, and then the conscious engagement, and then we have the consolidation and action, and that leads to the response. And too often, especially when a person is triggered, the response equals the reaction, and then that's where you get into some trouble. Now, I say this is 1 second. It could be 3/4 of a second. It's illustrative, right? That's what I put here. 7 phases of stimulus response, illustrative. It could be a half a second, I would say. And there's research out there that show that athletes, because of the fast twitch muscles, those aren't really just fast twitch muscles. It's fast twitch neural pathways, right? So that carries over. It's not just physical, it works on the mental side as well. And then this is what it can look like when you're triggered. So I have here most things, leading others, relationship life. This is just normal life, right? You're taking about a second. And this is why I say if you get add another quarter of a second or half a second, it's not the end of the world, right? It's no big deal. If you're fighting a tiger, that's a big deal. So, we make that distinction. And then here's high stakes situations, maybe going live, like I'm going live right now. So when I have glitches and things, it's easy for me to fall into this trap. But what I do is I take that breath and I slow things down because solving the glitch is easier if I'm here and I'm only losing a quarter of a second, half a second at the most. So it's like no big deal. It's going to be inconvenient anyway, regardless. But let me make it as less impactful as possible. So I make sure I stay here unless it's a Serengeti tiger. If there's an earthquake going on, I'll probably stop the live, right? But if it's not an earthquake, then what? I'm going to be more calm. So that's this one here. People can trip into this, and that's why I went through the habit first, because if you understand that you can stop tripping into this, you have power. And then this last one is like the tiger on the Serengeti, imminent accident, sports. This is where people let that imaginary driver jump out of the back seat and grab the wheel, and then they can't get the wheel back. So you can't get the wheel back once you've gotten here. The way to keep them from taking the wheel is by staying here, and the way to stay here is to take a breath. But you have to take that breath before the next stimulus. And what is the stimulus? It's a continuum, right? It's not like there's just one stimulus and then another stimulus. This is a more of just a constant barrage, right? Because it's processing 11 million bits per second. But you have to take the pause, not to try to stop what's already happening. You take the pause to slow what's coming, to slow it down. And if you close your eyes and just start counting to 7 or 10, you're going to slow down what's coming. And that's why I say get up, take a walk, look out the window, do something different to slow down what's coming so that you can get back here. If you don't do that, you're here. And once you're here, you can still turn it around. I say you have a minute or two, maybe 3, where you can still slow it down, but it's important. And that's why I do that 15-second every morning, 10 minutes every morning, inhaling for 15 seconds and exhaling for 15 seconds. I do that for 10 minutes straight every morning because what I'm doing is anchoring that feeling. So if I get thrown off course, if I get hit with a surprise, the first thing I do is take that long breath. And I don't have to take a 15-second breath. Just taking that first second or two anchors me back to that morning setting. Remember, in the morning, there's nothing going on. I haven't read emails yet. There's nothing. It's just me. And so I'm anchoring that state and I get back to that state. These are the tools that we have, the levers that we have. And we'll do this in the workshop. You'll do it real time because the point of the workshop is not just knowledge. It's about application of this. And then we have forgiveness. And I put this one in there because this is the one that can, even though relationships, because relationships involve other people, and even though we have control over the mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, and we're able to do that. Remember, on a bad day of a bad week, we could get triggered, and now we're doing something that, or saying something that we shouldn't be doing and saying. And so we need to close up, we need to heal those wounds. Again, not mental health. We need to heal those wounds that get associated to. There are people who get triggered into childhood pain. And I used the example yesterday as somebody you care about, you're 3 years old, and someone you care about, they knock the ice cream cone out of your hand, and it may seem a simple thing, and for whatever reason, just the dynamics, they make fun of you, and now they're making fun of you, and this is like the worst thing that's happened to you in your whole life, and they're making fun of you, and now all of a sudden you have this feeling about people you care about, and there's a wall because you never want to get hurt again. If that's unresolved, then it comes back up, and you can understand why some people are worried about relationships, or they talk about control issues, or whatever it is. So I'm not the therapist, I'm not talking about mental health, but if you understand that, then you understand forgiveness, and it's not just forgiveness of others, it's forgiveness of yourself. Now, if I bring up forgiveness and somebody's thinking about some situation that's really uncomfortable, they might say, "There's no way I'm going to forgive that person." So then we start talking about, well, you can forgive them, but not forget. You don't have to forget, and even that's problematic, right? Because now they're remembering. They don't want to remember it, so they put it out of their mind. But then it comes back up. But what you can do is you can forgive and set boundaries. And boundaries are on a continuum. You can set boundaries for yourself at the very low level, like for example, I'm not going to drink alcohol when I'm around these people, or I'm never going to drink more than 2 drinks when I'm out in public. Whatever it is, those are boundaries you can set for yourself, and you can set boundaries for other people. That we can go, but I need to make sure that uh, no one else comes in the car with us, or I need to. I'm going to drive. That's the maybe a boundary that you set. We'll go, but I'm going to be the one who's driving because you don't want to get caught in that situation where you're not in control. Whatever it is, I'm just using those examples. But boundaries are fluid, and you can have this big range of boundaries that you keep setting boundaries. I don't say set a boundary on every single thing. I like the rule of three. Happens one time, I take note of it. Happens the second time, I'm now thinking about my contingency plans. What's going to happen? How bad is this? Happens the third time, I'm already set up to put the boundary in place. I execute on the boundary, so I figure out what I want to do before I'm in pain. I don't wait 6, 7, 8, 9 times. It's too late then, because now you have emotion and you have anger and all these other things. So the reason I put forgiveness in there is because relationships and professional can knock us off kilter. We could be doing everything right here to have agency, but because relationships, professional situations open up or aggravate old wounds, we could get knocked off course. And that's why I put the forgiveness step in. It's very important. And then here's your 4 pillars of emotional intelligence: self-awareness and self-management. Without these two, social awareness and relationship management are going to be easily tainted. If you have a bad day, these can be tainted. So your social awareness has to be present. If you look at somebody who's in a high stress situation, their field of vision closes down. We call this like the red mist, and they're no longer truly aware of what's going on. They're just their internal experience, which is negative at that point, is driving more of their behavior and their action, and that's going to color your relationship management. So there's your 4 pillars. Knowledge. To know and not do is not know, but knowledge can open up doors and facilitate the assimilation of the new things. So when I talk about early adoption, I've got to have enough content and enough information to justify a person in taking that next step. And then habit mastery: by understanding habits, you recognize that you are more in control than you think. Even that imaginary driver from the back seat, is actually in your control when you understand how to deal with it. It's not correction, it's prevention. State mastery, controlling your state, is a big one. And everything I'm saying here, you can Google and find out all the things. You don't need me to tell you what to do for these 4 pillars. You can figure it out yourself. What we do in the workshop, though, is we actually do the exercises so you own it. And then there's your 4. So you can take a screenshot of that. So there's all 4 pillars at once. And then the 7 performance areas, which is your dashboard. How am I doing mentally? And so there's 2 sides of this. There's what do I need to know? What skills do I need to have? And then the other side of it is as a dashboard, how am I doing in this area? How am I doing in that area? Because you may know all the things to do emotionally. You may know it, but then you have to be able to access it. So this is like that step 2 in a way. It's like a dashboard. And there's your pillars. So that's the 4 pillars of self mastery. There's more information given in the workshop, more around levers and access to resources that you have. But the more important thing is to work through each of those 4 pillars so you know how to manage it, you know how to govern it, and you can have agency even on a bad day of a bad week, no matter what's going on around you, you can have agency. And I always say that feel free to join in the conversation. And just by clicking on that link, it's in the comments, I'll see you pop up. And then once I invite you on, we can have a side-by-side conversation about any of this, or you can put comments in the chat. I am on multiple platforms, and so I may not always see the comments, but I should see that link all, regardless of what platform you're on. And then if you want more information, like if you want to look at some of the earlier ones, because I did go through the 7 steps, I have videos on each of the 7 steps, and I have videos on other content out there. You can go and look at 7stepreset.com/live. So that's how you can get more information. I will be back tomorrow covering something similar. I may introduce another dimension of it because I want to keep pushing on this envelope. And then on next week, we'll get more into the levers. All right, we'll see you next time.